All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining this webinar on freeing the grid, where we're going to provide an overview of the state interconnection grades we released last month. My name is Mari Hernandez, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Regulatory Program at IREC. And I want to welcome you all and share a couple of housekeeping notes real quick. So first, this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with all webinar registrants after the event, and we'll also be sharing a copy of the slides. Also, aside from the webinar presenters and panelists, you should have come in muted, and please keep your microphone muted. And we'd like to ask for folks to submit questions through the chat box. And you can feel free to do that throughout the webinar. But we are going to hold on answering questions until the Q&A section at the end of the webinar. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dave Golombeski, who is a Senior Program Manager at IREC and worked closely with me on the development of Freeing the Grid interconnection grades. We can go to the next slide, and then I'll turn it over to you, Dave.
Hi, thanks everybody. Thanks, Mari. So just want to talk briefly about IREC. IREC is a 501c3 nonprofit that builds a foundation for rapid adoption of clean energy and energy efficiency to benefit people, the economy, and our planet. Its vision is a 100% clean energy future that is reliable, resilient, and equitable. IREC develops and advances regulatory reforms, technical standards, and workforce solutions needed to enable the streamlined integration of clean distributed energy resources. Next slide. So I want to briefly go over the agenda. The webinar today will be broken up to 3 chunks, I'd say. The first is the overview of Freeing the Grid. That's going to be about first 15 minutes, where we'll introduce what is Freeing the Grid, the grading methodology for it, some important takeaways that we want you all to have. We'll go over noteworthy best practices, and then how to use Freeing the Grid moving forward. And then the meat of this webinar will be a moderated panel led by Radina Volova, the Vice President of Regulatory Team, and then a Q&A at the end. Next slide, please. So Freeing the Grid is a joint initiative of IREC and Vote Solar that grades states on specific policies that help increase clean energy adoption and access to the grid. Between 2007 and 2017, the project team released 10 report cards that include state grades for both interconnection and net metering policies. IREC leads on interconnection policies, Vote Solar leads on net metering, and today we'll be going over the interconnection grades. And so interconnection policies specify the processes, timelines, costs, and technical requirements associated with connecting distributed energy resources, such as solar and energy storage systems, safely and reliably to the grid. Now, why focus on interconnection? Interconnection rules dictate how projects get reviewed and approved for operation on the electric grid. So it is critical that these rules recognize the unique capabilities of DERs and they are processed efficiently. If these rules are designed to promote streamlined review and clarity around timelines and costs, they can help to ensure that solar and other DERs are interconnected more rapidly. If these rules do not incorporate best practices related to costs, timelines, and a review process transparency, the result is often clogged interconnection queues and delays that can stretch for months or years, as well as canceled projects if required grid upgrade costs are too high. Next slide, please. All right, so go over the grading methodology. Freeing the Grid grades focus on statewide distribution level interconnection procedures. State interconnection procedures are approved by state public utility commissions and can be found in state rules or tariffs. The grades are based solely on provisions included or referenced within statewide interconnection procedures and do not take into account utility practices or requirements adopted outside of state procedures. Scoring is based on 56 criteria across 10 categories that were identified as best practices. These 56 criteria are worth 63 points total points. Each criteria has a point value ranging from 0.5 to 2 points based on its impact. You'll see the 10 categories on the right-hand side. Categories include timelines and efficiency, as well as streamlined review. I'll just briefly touch on both of those. So the streamlined review category, that is criteria related to how projects are reviewed for grid impacts and whether interconnection procedures require faster processing times for systems that meet standard requirements. The timeline and efficiency category, that measures whether the interconnection procedures specify timeframes for certain process steps and require efficient timelines for the review of interconnection applications and the stages of the grid impact review process. So that is all for me, and I'll hand it back to Mari.
Great, thanks, Dave. Next slide, please. So using the 56 criteria and methodology Dave just described, we evaluated the interconnection rules for any state that has adopted statewide interconnection procedures. And what we mean by that is procedures or rules that have been adopted by the state regulatory commission that apply to all regulated utilities. So we found through that process that 37 states plus Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico had adopted statewide interconnection rules. So you see those states and territories in green, yellow, orange, and pink in the map. And the states that have not yet adopted statewide rules are in red. So that means that the state does not require any regulated utilities to have interconnection rules. And then in the top right corner, you can see how the grades were distributed throughout. Next slide. And I'll go over that a little bit more on the next slide too. So the good news is that 7 states have incorporated more than half of the best practices that we identified in Freeing the Grid. New Mexico, as you saw on the map, has received the only A grade, and Arizona, California, Washington, D.C., Illinois, Michigan, and New York all received B grades. But then the bad news is that most state rules need to be revisited and updated. 32 states received either a C or a D grade, and then as I mentioned, there are 13 states that don't have statewide interconnection rules and received an F. And then just overall, we found that there's a lack of standardization and consistency across the states. And that means that developers that want to work across state lines must navigate varying processes and practices, as well as varying costs and timelines, which can ultimately slow down the investment in and deployment of distributed energy resources. And it's also important to note here that the best practices we identified in Freeing the Grid, those 56 criteria, work across state lines and do not have to be modified depending on the state. Next slide. So for both the state grade sheets and on the key takeaways webpage, we included 3 topics that we called out as noteworthy best practices. And we wanted to do that not only to highlight how important those practices are for streamlining interconnection, but also to call attention to the states that have incorporated them to date. So the transparency badge highlights the importance of information sharing both before and during the interconnection process. To receive this badge, a state's rules must require utilities to provide detailed information on grid conditions, process timelines, project impacts, and cost estimates. So those provisions are meant to increase process transparency and access to grid information to inform project siting and also project design decisions during the process. So only DC received this badge. For the energy storage badge, that recognizes states that have not only incorporated storage as an eligible technology that can be interconnected under the rules, but have also adopted provisions that unlock the unique characteristics of energy storage, including those related to controlling power exports to the grid, and technical review that takes into account how the system will actually be operated rather than assuming a worst case scenario. Only New Mexico and Illinois receive this badge. And then the provisions under the IEEE 1547-2018 badge update and clarify the technical requirements for distributed energy resources to connect to the grid. To receive this badge, the rules must incorporate IEEE 1547-2018 and identify or reference performance categories and default settings that are based on the 1547-2018 standard. Arizona, Hawaii, Maryland, and New Mexico receive this badge. Next slide. Sorry, I know we have a little bit of a delay on the slides. So how should states use Freeing the Grid? The way we'd like for Freeing the Grid to be used is for folks to review the grade sheet for their state to determine how they can improve their grades. We include recommendations, as you can see on the front, and sometimes those are carried over to the back of the page if more space was needed. So be sure to check on both sides. And then those recommendations are based on criteria that were not met by the state. The check marks and X's on the front of the page next to the categories are meant to be a guide for states to see where they may want to focus their efforts. So a check mark means that the state received at least half of the points in a category. So if you see an X next to any of the categories, you can review the criteria within that category to help identify additional improvements that could be made. If you go to the criteria webpage on the Freeing the Grid site, you'll find the full list of criteria broken out by those categories so you can identify provisions that could be improved. And we're planning to add a downloadable criteria list on that page so you can view the full list of criteria in PDF format. So that'll be coming soon. And then, of course, please reach out to me and Dave if you have further questions about your state's grade. We're happy to provide more detailed information. Dave already mentioned this about like, why is interconnection important? Why do we focus on this? But just want to highlight again how critical interconnection is to the clean energy transition and achieving our clean energy goals. It's a super important policy to get right and then to continually revisit to ensure that a state's rules are keeping up with the latest best practices. So this is where Freeing the Grid, our Freeing the Grid resource, the interconnection grades and the best practices we've identified, as well as IREC's model interconnection procedures come in. We want states to use these resources to improve their interconnection rules to ensure that they promote a transparent, fair, and efficient interconnection process that moves us swiftly toward a clean energy future. And now we're going to move to the moderated panel discussion. So I'm going to turn it over to Radina Belova, who is IREC's Regulatory Vice President. So we can go to the next slide and I'll kick it over to you, Radina.
Thank you very much, Maury. Much appreciated. I'm very excited to be here with you all today. To kick off the panel discussion, I'd like to begin by introducing our panelists. We have with us today Medhat Mofazi, who is Regulatory Program Engineer with IREC. He provides technical expertise as part of regulatory proceedings and working groups in that capacity, and assists in the development of IREC resources like Freeing the Grid. Prior to joining IREC, Medhat worked as DER integration specialist at Ameren, Illinois, and served as a technical lead in Illinois grid integration proceedings. Sky Stanfield is a partner at Shute, Mahali and Weinberger, where she represents IREC in grid modernization, interconnection, and energy storage proceedings. Sky has been working with IREC for more than a decade and is a leading expert on DER integration policies in the US. Nathan Phelps is the Managing Director of Vote Solar's Regulatory Advocacy Hub. Nathan's work focuses primarily on the regulation of distributed energy resources at state PUCs and includes advocating for just and inclusive policies to deliver the benefits of distributed energy resources to everyone. And last but certainly not least, Mari Hernandez is the Assistant Director of IREC's regulatory program and helps to support IREC's state regulatory work. Murray provides research and policy analysis to assist in the development of new reports and resources that highlight best practices related to DER integration. And she was the lead author, along with Dave Golombeski, of the Freeing the Grid report, with the support of the IREC, SMW, and Vote Solar teams. So welcome to our panelists. We are going to do the panels in 3 rounds of topics. First, we'll discuss how the project team approached scoring the 2023 Freeing the Grid state grades and the interconnection best practices that we included. Next, we'll touch on key takeaways from the state grades. And finally, we'll close with a highlight of big picture trends that emerged from this year's grading and where we see Freeing the Grid headed in the future. And a quick ground rule, panelists will have roughly 2 minutes for each response. Let's begin with you, Sky. 2 questions here, 2 big questions combined together. First, which of the Freeing the Grid grading criteria are most often not found in interconnection procedures? And why doesn't Freeing the Grid give credit for provisions that are not found in statewide interconnection rules, but maybe incorporated in a state's interconnection practices elsewhere?
Thanks, Radina, and welcome everybody. I'm happy to join you today. So in terms of which provisions are most often not included, I want to break them into sort of 2 categories quickly. The first are a lot of what I would call very well-established best practices, such as increasing the eligibility limits for fast track, where states that have not updated their procedures in many years, some cases over a decade, don't have these very well-established best practices. And then there's a second category, which are those that have emerged in more recent years, and thus it's taking a while for the uptake to happen. Those include the important provisions that we've added this year, for example, the energy storage related provisions. Specifically, states often either don't have energy storage mentioned at all in their procedures, haven't identified the difference between export capacity and nameplate capacity, identified how projects can control their capacity, what are the acceptable means, and incorporated those changes into their screening processes. States are also still just starting to roll out 1547 2018 adoption. That's another area that we don't see a lot of, although as states are opening proceedings more and more often, they're doing those. So when you look at the Freeing the Grid criteria, you'll see some practices that are very well developed and have been in place for well over a decade in many states, but states that haven't adopted any updates will be missing many of those. And then you have the more current practices, which reflect really important evolutions for critical things like energy storage and smart inverters. And then the second question is, why don't we give credit for provisions that aren't in interconnection procedures? And this is a complicated issue associated with how we can do the grading process. The main reason is that we wanted the process to be reflected. We want policy to be reflected in the rules where possible. And it's difficult to grade practices that aren't well memorialized if they're not in the rules, for example, in an order, or they may be informal practices, but that haven't yet been established in an order. It's difficult to consistently track those and grade those. Although we do encourage states that understand that states may adopt things in different ways, and ultimately getting to the best practices is the most critical thing, even if it's not done directly in the procedures. But if you look through your state's grading criteria and you say, oh, wait, we're doing that, we're just doing it over here, or it's not in the rules, that's the most important thing to focus on.
Yeah, a quick follow-up question on that, Sky. In addition to it being difficult to track where all of the provisions are, if they're not located in the interconnection rules, can you talk a little bit about the importance of, very briefly, about the importance of having the statewide procedures be reflected all in one place for purposes of making sure that they're implemented appropriately?
Yeah, so again, like I said, we really prefer that these practices be memorialized in the rules for 2 reasons. One is providing transparency to those parties that are looking to participate and submit interconnection applications or participate in the additional processes associated with that. They know where to find them. They know what's happening. It's clear and transparent. And the commission has fully reviewed them and adopted them. And then additionally, it's difficult to hold utilities and interconnection customers accountable for the process if it's not well memorialized in the rules. And we want to strive for consistent practices across the state versus lots of different utility pathways, because it's difficult for interconnection customers to manage all those different processes. We want them to be consistent and transparent.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. The next question here is for Midhat. One of the noteworthy best practices that Freeing the Grid identified and that was highlighted earlier is related to the IEEE 1547-2018 standard. Can you explain why it's important to incorporate that standard as well as well as its default settings and other technical requirements within interconnection procedures?
Yeah, thanks, Radina. So IEEE 1547, just a quick background, is considered as the go-to standard for DR installations, including energy storage systems. The 2003 document is the initial version of the standard that provides the foundation for DR interconnection. A full revision of the standard took place in 2018, requiring DRs to be capable of providing grid-supportive functions that are related to voltage, frequency, communications, and controls. Basically, the new standard offers a menu of options that should be considered. Some functionalities within the standard are present all the time. Some can be deactivated in places of other better grid functions. Jurisdictions need to consider many items. So things like performance categories. Do I set my DR to normal performance A or B? I know these letters may not mean anything to you, but it does to those who are trying to implement these features. Do I set my DR abnormal performance categories 1, 2, or 3? Better yet, perhaps the most important revelations in the updated standards were to require DRs to have voltage regulations capability. Then again, same considerations need to occur for voltage regulation capabilities. Do I activate voltage regulations functions like volt-var and volt-watt? If so, what are the default settings? We do not have all the time here to go into details here, but the idea is if advanced features like voltage regulations are utilized, so seeing things like volt-var is activated instead of, say, unity power factor, the grid is likely to enable a higher penetration of DERs while still maintaining the grid safety and reliability. But because we are talking about many smart functionalities within the standard, state rules that are based on the older version of the standard will need to be updated to reflect these changes. It is important to clearly define DR settings in a statewide rule to help minimize confusion on the expected settings and streamline the adoption of these smart functionalities in each jurisdictions. For more information on incorporating the IEEE 2018 version in your jurisdictions, IREC developed a decision option matrix for adapting the standard that help regulators, utilities, and the DR industries to streamline the adoption process of the standard. I'll put a link in the chat for anyone interested in understanding these sort of questions and decisions options that need to be brought in the table to be considered as part of the update. Thank you.
Thank you, Midhat. Our next question here is for Nathan. First, let's start with a quick introduction to Vote Solar, Nathan, and then please tell us a little bit about Vote Solar's work on equitable access to clean energy and how you're thinking about interconnection in relation to that.
Thanks, Rita. So Vote Solar, we, like IREC, we're a 501c3 nonprofit. We're dedicated to realizing a 100% clean energy future. And we increasingly are focused on a just and equitable future in our energy system. So we try to embed equity into all of our work now, and that includes freeing the grid. So over the past 9 months, Vote Solar has convened our Access and Equity Advisory Committee to look at interconnection from an equity lens. This work is still ongoing, so I don't have the final product to present here today, but we believe that there are opportunities to think about equity in interconnection. A few examples of that include community engagement, how the utilities actually engage and discuss interconnection, especially in underserved communities, transparency, which has already been mentioned, and a recognition and a solution that many underserved communities have decades of underinvestment in grid infrastructure, and this directly impacts interconnection, the amount of DER that can actually be brought to the grid in these communities.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And the final question in this round goes to Maury. One of the provisions that's new to Freeing the Grid this year is related to incorporating policies that help to streamline or reduce the costs of interconnection for projects that benefit disadvantaged or underserved households. So this is carrying over from the theme of the last question to Nathan as well. How did you decide on including this new provision in particular in Freeing the Grid?
Yeah, so first off, I want to give credit here for Vote Solar's leadership in this space. It's definitely an emerging area of interconnection policy, and the work that Olivia, Ned, and others at Vote Solar have been doing on this to both convene community organizations and experts and to move it forward has been pretty incredible. So IREC has been helping to co-facilitate the Access and Equity Advisory Committee that Nathan mentioned. And that process was just kicking off as we were discussing and developing the best practices that would be included in Freeing the Grid. So the provision we ended up including that is basically looking at whether or not the state has incorporated any policy aimed at reducing the cost or time burden of interconnection, specifically for disadvantaged or underserved households, which is basically what the question says. That's just, that language is all we ended up adding because we really wanted to signal that states should be thinking about how equity should be brought into the interconnection policy space, but we weren't too prescriptive because we didn't have, kind of a well-vetted best practice to point to. So we kind of started with that more vague provision that helps to capture any provision that addresses interconnection barriers that could impact those communities. So we're planning to further refine that provision in Freeing the Grid in the future, but did want to provide credit for any state that was incorporating any equity measure before we got to those more specific provisions. In New Mexico is the only state that we found that had any type of provision within its interconnection rules. Again, this is specifically, we're looking specifically at the interconnection rules. And we found it under its cost sharing provision, where it includes increasing clean energy access to low income or underserved communities as a determinant for whether the project is deemed as having a public benefit and then would qualify for cost sharing either among other projects or other ratepayers. So again, our longer term plan is to come up with some specific provisions to address equity within interconnection policies that we hope will help provide further guidance to states on this topic.
Great, thank you so much. We're now transitioning to the second round of questions focused on highlights from individual state grades as well as key takeaways from the grading. So we're going to begin with Sky again. Sky, the Freeing the Grid website notes that New Mexico has incorporated the highest number of best practices out of any state. And IREC participated in the state's last interconnection proceeding, still ongoing, in which it adopted its new rules just last year. And it would be great if you could share a little bit about what prompted New Mexico to adopt those updates and how New Mexico earned an A grade.
Sure. First of all, let's start by giving a big round of applause to New Mexico for the long and hard process they went through to get to this point. And we're really, really proud of all the stakeholders that participated in that process and the work that the commission put into that effort. And, you know, we didn't know which states were going to come out at the top, and we're really delighted to see that New Mexico did so much work to get there. There's a couple things that prompted that process in New Mexico. First of all, New Mexico's interconnection procedures hadn't been updated since 2008, I believe. That is over a decade, indeed 15 years ago. And as you all know, a whole lot has changed in the world of solar and energy storage since that time. So they had a lot of work to do in terms of bringing those standards up to the current technical and process improvements that other states have been working on for many years. And then New Mexico has been getting a lot more engaged and interested in the deployment of distributed energy resources. They have a lot of new rulemakings. They're working on a lot of innovative policies. In particular, they had recently adopted a community solar program, and they were wise in recognizing that as they rolled out that program, that they probably needed to update their interconnection procedures to ensure that they were capable of handling those new interconnection applications. And there also had been some challenges for smaller rooftop solar projects in certain areas of the grid in New Mexico. And I think those factors all influenced the commission's decision to open a proceeding. Now getting to how did they earn the grade? One of the things that is challenging in some interconnection proceedings is that if you haven't done anything in a while, or a lot of states focus on, I'm going to do X, Y, or Z, just a narrow scope of what they want to do and how they open the proceeding. What New Mexico did was start with a much broader what needs to be done question, and particularly focused on looking at models and best practices. They looked at both IREC's model rules and the small generator interconnection proceedings and tried to take a look at what are all the best practices that we should include. And rather than narrowing their scope to just a couple problems, they were open to sort of doing a wholesale update. And that, I think, is what really led to them getting an A, is that they recognize that if we haven't done something since 2008, we're going to need to do a lot of work, and it's worthwhile to do the work to get us to that A grade, so to speak, even though they didn't know what they were going to get at the time. Rather than just trying to tackle one thing at a time. And the thing that's interesting about that is that sounds overwhelming, and it does take a lot of work, but often we see proceedings where they're just working on one or two issues and they take just as long. When you have something like IREC's model procedures, freeing the grid, and other states you can look to, it's not that difficult to do a comprehensive update and check all those boxes in the freeing the grid grading criteria. So we hope that New Mexico's work can serve as inspiration for other states. Not all states need to do a comprehensive update because they are more actively updating their procedures. And that's where you can look to freeing the grid to see, well, where are we? Like, what are the things that we need to focus on? You've probably gotten a variety of different scores, and that's kind of what freeing the grid helps to do, is really focus in on what you need to do. In some states, they need to do almost everything, and in other states, they're keeping up with the process and can do it in a more incremental way.
Thank you. The next question is for Mari, and now we're going to look to Hawaii. In Freeing the Grid, Hawaii is highlighted as an example of a state with interconnection rules that may be lagging behind the way interconnection is implemented in the state, meaning the reality on the ground reflects practices that are better than what is reflected in the written rules themselves. Can you talk a little bit more about these discrepancies and whether this may be occurring in other states as well?
Sure. So this goes back to what we talked about before on what we based our scoring on, since we compared the Freeing the Grid best practices to just the provisions in the interconnection tariff in Hawaii. The state grade doesn't reflect some of those newer practices that we found out are being applied during the interconnection process. So as an example, the rules include a penetration screen within initial review. It says that aggregated generation cannot exceed 15% of the line section peak load in order to pass the screen. But we heard from the utility Hawaiian Electric Company that they use actual hosting capacity during technical review rather than that more conservative 15% of peak load screen. And then similarly, the timeline requirements in the interconnection tariff for just a few of the process steps don't align with best practices. But again, their utility reporting on interconnection timelines show that HECO, Hawaiian Electric Company, is reviewing proposed projects more quickly than what is required in the rule. And then as far as other states, there aren't any that we're aware of that have improved their practices outside of the rule update process, but that is definitely a good area for further research. So we have not done that research to date. But grading solely on the rules isn't meant to lessen the importance of good implementation, but really it's to promote greater transparency and consistency across utility jurisdictions within a state, and also to improve accountability for both utilities and interconnection customers.
Thanks, Mari. Next question is for Medhat. Are there any states you're aware of that received lower than an A grade and that are currently in the process of updating their rules? If so, are they likely to incorporate any of the best practices identified in Freeing the Grid?
Yeah, so I would say Oregon is perhaps a good example here. Currently, we have a letter D grade assigned in the state rules, but the commission there is just about to open up rulemaking that will see a lot of good practices implemented. Ahead of that rulemaking, IREC, utilities, other stakeholders, including the commission staff, have been able to reach a lot of consensus that came out from New Mexico, even from the batteries toolkit, including the use of limited export provisions, updating to the new IEEE 1547, the use of supplemental review process, which wasn't there, as well as increasing tier 1 sizes to 50 kW nameplate with 25 kilowatt export capacity. Basically, the anticipated updates to the rules in the state will recognize and streamline the interconnection of energy storage systems to the grid, as well as incorporate a lot of the features that came out from New Mexico. So if all goes well, we may have updated rules in the state perhaps early next year.
That's great to hear. Thanks, Medhat. And finally, closing out this section with Nathan. Nathan, you have a lot of experience in the state of Massachusetts in particular, and that's an example of a state with good clean energy policies and ambitious climate goals. Did it surprise you that the state received a C grade for interconnection? And in your view, what does it need to focus on, not just to improve its interconnection grade, but also to achieve its clean energy goals more broadly?
Thanks, Regina. So I am not surprised that Massachusetts received a C grade. I think Massachusetts is an example of a state that made a lot of great improvements in interconnection about a decade ago. But then the state just kind of hit cruise control. And so a lot of the improvements weren't continued. And so that stagnation really has led to, in my opinion, Massachusetts falling behind some of the other states. Now, as in regard to improvements that Massachusetts could make, there's a lot of things I could say. I'll just stick with one though, and I'll just highlight energy storage. So Massachusetts has actually put a lot of incentives out there for the adoption of energy storage in their programs. There's whole programs dedicated to just energy storage. Unfortunately, the interconnection process in Massachusetts does not explicitly include energy storage as an eligible technology. And that has led to numerous design, operational, and monetary problems for customers that are trying to adopt energy storage. This is really problematic. As an example, for instance, if a customer goes to install a solar system that has energy storage tied to it, many of the investor-owned utilities will actually just combine the capacity and review it as if both could potentially export at their maximum. This sometimes bumps customers out of eligible programs. It's very, very problematic, and it's not really reflective of reality and how these storage will be used. So that is one area that I think is very, very problematic for Massachusetts and other states.
Thank you for highlighting that. Yeah, I can certainly see how that relates to big picture wanting to achieve their ambitious climate and clean energy goals, and storage is such a key element of that effort. We're going to transition now into the final round of questions focused on what are the big picture trends we saw in doing the grading this year and what is the future of freeing the grid. So starting with you, Maury, one of the takeaways from freeing the grid this year is that many states need to update their interconnection rules in order to be reflective of best practices. So hopefully there will continue to be improvements. As Midhat said, Oregon, that's not currently reflected as a state with a high score, will have updated rules sometime next year. Do you plan to reevaluate state interconnection rules periodically to track such future changes and update state grades?
Yeah, thanks, Radina. Just before I answer that, I want to just point out that, again, if you could submit any questions you have in the chat, once we finish this round of questions, we'll be sure to start answering those, but I don't think we've seen many questions come in, so please feel free to do that. But yes, on reevaluating state interconnection rules, we do plan to update the grades periodically. We haven't yet determined how frequently. This will partially depend on our capacity and funding, but we'll continue to track state progress on interconnection. So Oregon and other states that are currently working on updates and any others that come up, because we'll continue to, do some of our regulatory intervention work, and we also continue to monitor any states that are working on interconnection or grid modernization. So we'll continue to do that as well and kind of keep up with what states are doing and what grades would need, or what scoring would need to be updated to come up with new grades. We'll also continue to identify and assist in the development of best practices, and we do plan to update the Freeing the Grid interconnection scoring criteria every couple of years or so to keep up with any emerging practices that can help to improve the interconnection process. So yes, definitely plan to update grades in the future. We don't have an exact frequency or timing for the next one, but it will likely be kind of on a, maybe quarterly or semi-annual basis, and see which states have made improvements, and then maybe do a quick release for what those new grades are, and maybe not do a complete update of all grades at those times. So yes, definitely stay tuned on that, and we'll make sure to highlight those as we make those changes.
Great, thank you. Turning now to Sky Next. We've already mentioned, or you had brought up earlier, Sky, in the case of New Mexico, that they hadn't updated their rules since sometime in 2008, and other states are similarly situated in that they haven't updated their rules in 5 to 10 years, which means when they do begin the process of revising their interconnection procedures, they'll have quite a bit of work to do. Where should those states begin? And in general, how often should states be revisiting and updating their interconnection rules?
Yeah, so as I noted already, the DER market is moving fast, both in terms of the number of states that have really are pushing for a lot of deployment of distributed energy resources at a variety of different scales, and the technologies themselves are moving fast. And so for that reason, states do need to keep up with their processes in a more proactive way, and I'll explain that a little bit more in a second. So, but starting with whether you've looked at your rules last year or whether you haven't looked at them in 20 years, and there are some states that it has been that long, that the IREC produces a bunch of resources specifically focused on helping states with this. So obviously Freeing the Grid, which we're here to talk about today, is a place you can start with by looking at what's your state's grade and specifically what are the criteria where you did or did not get points. IREC also publishes model interconnection procedures, and we are releasing a new update to the model procedures just in a couple of weeks. So you'll see it this summer. And that's another place states can start with by looking at what additional procedures are in there, and we have model language. It makes it pretty easy to go ahead and do those. And then obviously you need to assess where your state is itself in terms of hearing from interconnection customers and from utilities about what the biggest challenges are. And I would say don't stop there. Don't think about just what the most immediate challenges are, but look ahead. Is your state about to adopt a community solar program? Are you looking to do vehicle to grid electric vehicle charging, for example? States often look at like crises that are happening now, but because rulemakings typically take a number of years to complete, you want to look ahead and be progressive and proactive about addressing interconnection challenges. If you're here on this webinar, you probably know that interconnection is one of the biggest challenges, if not the biggest challenge facing almost all different scale of distributed energy resources today. And I want to note that both with Freeing the Grid and with IREC's model rules, we're relatively conservative in identifying what the best practices are. We look to what states have already done in most cases to identify those. But we know that even in states where they have pretty good procedures and are keeping up, that there are still challenges. So there's lots of room for innovation here. And I want to encourage states to recognize that things are moving fast and interconnection is going to have to move fast too. And we're going to have to be willing to innovate and try new things if we're really going to meet our clean energy goals. So in sum, there are lots of resources available to identify what the best practices are. You want to talk to your local installers and your utilities to understand what are the biggest hurdles facing them. And then you want to look ahead and see what's coming down the pike and how do we make procedures that are able to adapt to these fast changing conditions.
Great, thank you so much, Sky. Next question is for Midhat. Some of the newer best practices related to technical screens and enabling storage systems to operate in export control mode came out of the Batteries Project, which was a 3-year effort supported by the DOE to develop best practices for storage interconnection. Can you share more about that project and how those new storage interconnection procedures will improve both storage interconnection and its flexible operation on the grid?
Yeah, thanks, Radina. So the Batteries Project included several partners. EPRI was in there, also some co-op, and Pacific was one of the utilities that was part of the project. At the end, the partners or the team developed the toolkit. So the toolkit was developed, includes solutions to the key interconnection challenges that affect energy storage. It also standardized the use of export controls to enable limited and non-exporting systems. A list of defined control methods are categorized and realized in the toolkit, some of these methods or all these methods can mitigate or avoid grid impacts. So they're all recognized, and the toolkits provide model interconnection rule language that can essentially be copied and pasted as a freestanding section into any interconnection rule. Just to give you a quick example, maybe interconnection applicants that want to use energy storage in their DR design can now look at the export provisions that came out from the toolkit and identify necessary information to design their system. And they can do this before submitting that application. And if, let's say, I'm a residential customer, then I can now put a PV system and storage and have a power control system, PCS, in my design to limit my export to, say, 25 kW, all of which can be done and still be able to meet the level 1 or streamlined review processes. For more information about the toolkit, if you're not familiar with, I'll point you to Chapter 3, which has the list of recognized export control methods that utilities and whoever is screening the project can use those, and whoever is designing their project can see that to make sure however they design the system, if they choose one of those methods, then it's likely to be streamlined a review process. Also, Chapter 4 talks more about the screens themselves, on how they were changed from using the business as usual worst case scenario, which is nameplate value, versus the new concept of using export capacity, which is the actual value or threshold is getting pushed back to the grid.
Thanks, Midhat. And an additional note there, on the website that Midhat will share, we also have recorded trainings on those subjects. If you're more of an audio-visual learner, you can also learn more about the issues Midhat mentioned that way. The last question for the panel discussion goes back to you, Nathan. As Freeing the Grid continues to evolve, would you like to see other types of grades in addition to interconnection and DER compensation be included in the future?
The short answer is yes, absolutely. While Freeing the Grid has historically included grades for net metering policies in each state, enough states have transitioned away from net metering to alternative compensation frameworks. So this can be good and bad, depending on the situation, but this does necessitate a grade for DER compensation rather than just net metering. In addition to DER compensation, we aspire to grade each state based on energy equity policies. This is very much in the planning stages, but we hope to deliver an energy equity scorecard in the future. And ideally, this will help each state realize where they can actually improve to make the system a little bit more just and fair for everyone. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And that's a lovely note to end on. I certainly echo your hope that we do see that in the future and look forward to working with you on that. We're now going to transition to questions from the audience. So a big round of applause and thank you to our panelists for your insights. And I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Gwen Brown, IREC's Vice President of Communications, to facilitate the Q&A portion. And thank you for the claps I'm seeing showing up on the screen here. Much appreciated. And also clap back to you, our audience, for showing up to listen about interconnection. All right, Gwen, take it away.
Thanks, Radina, and thanks everyone for joining us today. If you have any questions that you haven't had a chance to ask, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll do our best to get to them. To kick us off, we have a question from Bill, who says that he believes the state of Colorado is helping towns standardize and automate their solar permitting processes. And they are curious about whether that is reflected in these interconnection grades.
I can take that one. Thank you for the question. It is not reflected in the grades. So we just focused on what was in the interconnection rule or interconnection procedures or, tariff. We didn't focus on anything outside of that. So their permitting process would not be included in that. Not that it's not a part of the overall process of integrating the DER into the grid, but we just focused on the rules. So that's another case of, but they also didn't not get any credit for it or, because it wasn't in the rules. So it wasn't something that there was a criteria on specifically either. So yeah, if that doesn't answer your question, please feel free to add another chat question in there.
Thanks, Mary. Our next question comes from Brent, who asked, is there any indication of federal level or FERC policy to level the playing field? They note that with 3,000 utilities and all of the municipal utilities in California, they are regularly running into interconnection rules that differ from utility to utility.
I can take that one, and that's actually a really good question. So one of the, I won't go super legal wonky on y'all here, but I think one of the important things to recognize is FERC's authority in the context of distributed energy resources is somewhat limited. States do have authority over distributed energy resource interconnections unless they essentially are engaged in interstate transactions or participating in wholesale markets. However, FERC historically has played a very important role in providing models or best practices to states as in terms of using the federal small generator interconnection procedures, or SGIP, which was adopted both as a set of federal interconnection procedures for small interconnections, but also as a model for states. And unfortunately, FERC has not updated the small generator interconnection procedures in almost a decade now. There is currently a very large docket about interconnection at FERC, but it appears that that is going to focus principally on the larger scale transmission bulk system interconnections and not on distributed interconnections. On behalf of IREC, we are very interested in FERC engaging in this issue more, and I'll highlight two reasons for that. One is that states do look to FERC for guidance, and FERC has an important role in being able to vet best practices and communicate a consistent set of procedures that states can look to model from. But also, FERC has actually been handing off a fair bit of its own responsibility over the distributed energy resource space. So one of the areas that has evolved in recent years is allowing distributed resources to participate in wholesale markets. So although they are at the interconnected on the distribution system, which is typically, though not always, state jurisdictional, if you had historically participated in a wholesale market, you would have become FERC jurisdictional. They have said that states should have authority over those distributed interconnections that are participating in the markets, but that's sort of an abdication of their responsibility to ensure there is open access to those markets. So if procedures are not ready, and for example, don't even include energy storage in the procedures, it's unclear how there is going to be open market access for those distributed energy resources that want to participate in the wholesale markets. So we think there's a good case for FERC to engage in this area. But unfortunately, there does not appear to be any known activity yet for distributed interconnections. We encourage folks to reach out to FERC and communicate the need for their guidance here.
Thanks, Guy. We have another question asking whether IREC and Vote Solar used time to PTO, or time to permission to operate, data to figure out which practices are most effective. And if not, what interconnection data was used to establish the best practices?
Yeah, I can take this one, and anyone else, please feel free to jump in, because I think this is a really good question and highlights a couple of things. But first, just so you know how we identified the best practices, we've really, we've had a collaborative effort with stakeholders and utilities within regulatory proceedings, working groups, and then research-based projects like the batteries project that Midhat talked about earlier. We've been actively engaged in regulatory proceedings on interconnection for more than a decade. And, we also have trusted engineering and policy expertise that has allowed us to work with all stakeholders to identify some effective solutions to interconnection barriers. And then we've also, as you've probably seen, released model language that can be used by states in their interconnection procedures. And then every few years, try to ensure that states are aware of the latest best practices and can use our resources to help update their rules. That doesn't get to, so what are we seeing in terms of how is that translating into timelines and how quickly things are moving? I think that's been the really hard part, is that data are not always available for every state. And that's one of the things we looked at. And you can look in our criteria, in the criteria or on the criteria webpage of Freeing the Grid. And that's, I don't know that we've put the link in the chat. Maybe someone has and I haven't seen it, but it's freeingthegrid.org if you haven't been there yet. And you can actually see how many states have adopted each criterion in that list. So it's broken up by the different categories. And so that's where you can see where there is reporting on timeline data. One of the categories is reporting on timelines and cost data. So sometimes states are given partial credit if they only require timeline reporting, but we want states to move toward doing some upgrade cost reporting as well. So what we really need there are the data, and that's something that we did not do. So to more directly answer your question, we didn't look at the timeline from when you apply to when the system gets permission to operate. What we are doing is we are relying on best practices we've developed through our regulatory experience and through working with developers and through working with utilities, and we just don't have the data to really look at how that's always translating into actual timelines. But that's something that we want, and that's something that we're continuing to push for. So I think it's a great question and something that would be great to include in the future in some way.
Mari, if I may add, I think on the, I'm not sure if the question was directed at this as well, but we did provide some grade or points to states to interconnection rules that specifically provided a time frame for the utility to provide the permission to operate, PTO. So if that is recognized in the rule, how much time from passing the witness test to when they're supposed to give the applicant or the customer PTO, then we did provide a grade on that. But I'm not sure if the question was asking on that angle as well.
Thanks, Mita, and thanks, Mari. Another question we've received is, how do technologies such as flexible interconnections account, or how are they accounted for in the scoring?
I'm super glad that somebody asked this question. Again, good questions coming in. Thanks everyone for challenging us with these. So flexible interconnection is a super important policy, but that is not well developed in any state interconnection procedures. It's being done in a few pilot cases and is being done abroad, but hasn't really been memorialized in any state interconnection procedures in a solid way yet. That is why it is not currently reflected in the Freeing the Grid grades. However, as I noted in response to one of the questions during the panel, this is one of those areas where we absolutely need states to start innovating, and we hope that we can include provisions around flexible interconnection in the next update or in coming years. And there's a couple of things I can point you to help with that. So as Midhat discussed, and we put a link in the chat for this, the Batteries Project discussed some aspects of flexible interconnection. And you can look to that report. And also we did a specific series of webinars associated with those, which are available on the energystorageinterconnection.org website. I guess I should say for everybody else, what is flexible interconnection? So flexible interconnection is not a defined term in any formal way yet, and it can mean a variety of different practices, but essentially allowing projects to interconnect and be curtailed in some way where grid impacts occur, especially where there's just a small number of those, which will enable them to build larger capacity and especially export during peak times of need, but not export during periods when there isn't as much demand. That's what that concept is generally getting to. And finally, I'll say we are inching towards that through some of the important things like identifying export control technologies and taking those into account in the screening processes, which are currently reflected in Freeing the Grid. So good question, stay tuned, and also encourage your states to work on this so that we can include it in the next Freeing the Grid.
Thanks so much, Sky. We've also gotten another question from Alice, who is talking about a system that she's been waiting for interconnection approval on for 3 years in PG&E territory. and they mentioned that they are considering adding battery storage and skipping grid interconnection. And she's curious to hear what other options might they have, since customers are so at the mercy of their utilities.
So it's hard to comment on any one particular project circumstance without knowing more background around that. But first of all, Ellis, we hear your frustration, and it's not uncommon to hear of these challenges anywhere in the country. So going off the grid, installing energy storage, and just disconnecting entirely is an option, but of course it's an expensive option and it's probably not practical for a lot of customers. California is working on a lot of provisions associated with facilitating a faster and clearer process. And I recommend that if you are facing challenges, that you ensure that you communicate with the Public Utilities Commission staff that works on interconnection. The other thing that's happening in California is we just had, thanks to IREC's participation, we finally got some timeline reporting in California, and just had a workshop facilitated by the utilities to discuss their last 2 years of timeline reporting. And what that workshop showed is that PG&E in particular is abysmally behind on their interconnection timelines. Now, this is a good opportunity for me to say, it's time for parties who are stuck in that slow process to speak up and tell the Public Utilities Commission that they want the commission to engage actively in ensuring the utilities are meeting their obligations. The commission has not committed to any enforcement or accountability measures to actually ensure that PG&E and the other utilities get on track. I should say that SDG&E is doing quite well. Edison is doing better than PG&E, but still has some delays. So reach out to your Public Utilities Commission and make sure they know that this is an important issue for you.
Thanks, Guy. One thing, if I could add on this, and I want to be clear, what I'm about to say is not related to the scorecards for any state. It's just a theoretical conversation here. But I think, Alice, you bring up a good point, which is if interconnection becomes such an impediment for people that want to take action, there are alternatives. And that actually is a reason to actually make interconnection better. From a theoretical perspective, every situation is different, but it's actually better if we all stay on the grid and help each other out. Grid costs can be lower that way. We can actually support each other with distributed energy resources. But if interconnection processes are not up to the task, customers will start to drop off the grid. And I've made this case in front of PUCs before, I've made this case to utilities, and it doesn't seem to be a reality that they're really willing to accept, which is a problem.
Thanks, Nathan, and thank you, Sky. Another question that we've gotten relates to how one would go about finding advocacy organizations that focus on improving interconnection. The individual notes that they are a residential ratepayer and they want to do their part to push their PUC and their legislature to move faster on this issue.
Todd, are you able to take this one? I know you've been involved in
is that
Oregon.
specific to Oregon?
Yes.
Yeah.
You need the question again?
Yes, please.
The question is from an individual in Oregon who is wondering what is the best way to find Oregon's advocacy organizations that focus on improving interconnection. They're a residential ratepayer and they want to help push their PUC and legislature to move faster on this issue.
Yeah, so we have been engaged there for over a year now with workshop, and there's definitely a lot of active local groups, including OSEA and others I can't remember right now, but I'll be happy to email contacts if they can reach out to you, Gwen, or me directly.
Parties may
Yep.
also, I always encourage parties to reach out again to the Public Utilities Commission staff if they're interested in engaging. Often they can point them to ways that are easier for individual ratepayers to submit public comments and so on. And I know that the Oregon staff is quite helpful and cooperative. So in addition to reaching out to IREC, I encourage people to always let the commission know that you're interested and see how they can facilitate your participation.
And you'll see my email and Dave's email up on the screen, and feel free to reach out to one or both of us, and we can connect you to Midhat as well.
Thank you all. We also have another question, which is, from your experience in regulatory proceedings, have you found any major drivers or conditions that have resulted in better outcomes among the states in the lead for interconnection regulations? Are there good models that are repeatable in other jurisdictions?
You guys want me to take this one too? So there's, a really wide variety of different ways that states start interconnection proceedings. And I think that the critical pieces that IREC recommends is that, first of all, that the state look to best practices, and that parties, when they first engage, encourage use of models, and whether it's IREC's model or look to what other states have done if there's a particular policy you want to recommend, and encourage states to not belabor and look to reinvent the wheel all the time unless they're looking to be additionally innovative. In terms of process elements that result in better outcomes, we always think it's helpful for parties to come together and have a series of workshops or working groups. And that's important because often parties are far apart on their understanding of the basic challenges and issues. And so bringing people together to have a conversation and negotiate to some extent helps bring common understanding to what the real challenges are and narrow those. They may not be total agreement on what the solutions are, but a good understanding of what the actual challenge is comes through those dialogues. However, those working group processes can extend for a very long time, and the commission needs to be aware that these processes can drag out, and certain parties are incented to drag them out. And so providing opportunity for dialogue, but after that dialogue is complete or there has been adequate discussion, having a direct pathway to get to a commission decision, either through a working group report, comments, and then a commission decision or other pathway. Just doing working groups without a clear pathway to commission decision is a clear way for things to drag out for a very long time. So my two recommendations, again, are to encourage states to look to existing models and best practices and not try to reinvent the wheel in every case. Utilities often will say it's different here, but actually what we hear is the same thing. Again, a lot of this is just physics, and it doesn't matter what state you're in, things operate the same. And to provide opportunity for dialogue, but also make sure that the commission is engaged in that process and has a pathway to decision making.
One other thing I'd note, and this is, Sky has already mentioned this, but I just want to reiterate it. Oftentimes the impetus for change is people reaching out to the Public Utility Commission to let them know that there's a problem in the first place. Oftentimes commissioners, staff don't really know that there's a problem if nobody is speaking up. So if there are issues in a particular state, have residents, have the people that are actually paying their electric bills reach out and say, we are having a problem with, say, installing a system with interconnection, etc.
Great. Thank you, Nathan, and thank you, Sky. We've now reached the end of our allotted time for questions, so I am going to hand it back over to Regina for our final section.
Sure. Thanks so much, Gwen. I think if folks want to stick around for a little longer, we sure can respond to a few additional questions. Maury, what do you think?
Yeah, I know that there were a couple of comments. So if for folks that want to stay on, we can just kind of quickly respond to a couple of comments. Otherwise, yeah, I think we can wrap things up. And did want to note, I saw Lindsay's comment here about the resource, there being a regulatory docket open and using Freeing the Grid as a resource. So that's great. And so glad that you let us know that. And definitely feel free to reach out to us again if you have other questions, like specific questions about your state grade and how we did the scoring. We're happy to provide more information and follow up with you.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you to all of your great questions and comments. I do want to acknowledge in the chat, both from Stephen and Bob regarding Hawaii and distribution planning. We saw your notes, and I think we'll definitely be taking that into consideration as we discuss the future of Freeing the Grid. And thank you to Maury and Dave for their great presentations, and our panelists for your insights, and everyone in the audience for your great questions and joining us today to talk about the wonky topic of interconnection. We do have a question here, administrative question. Can we get a copy of the chat? Since that involves statements made from folks other than the IREC team as part of this presentation, I guess I don't have an immediate answer to that. We will get back to you just to make sure that, we're not dealing with any privacy issues. Oh, links. Yes, you 100%. We can share the links, follow up to this. Any final parting words, Maury?
No, just thank you all for joining, and happy to work with you all on how to, identifying best practices for your state and looking at closer at your interconnection grade through Freeing the Grid. All right, and with that, I think we'll go ahead and close the webinar. Thank you so much to our panelists and to Dave for presenting along with me. Thank you to Radina for moderating the panel, and just thank the IREC team, especially the comms team, for helping this to run smoothly. So thank you all. All right. Bye, everyone.